Hey, so this is Ramon. Channel is Alpha Centurion. This is going to be a short response to a guy named Danny from Grr Mania, from one of Grr Mania's chat, because I kind of dropped the ball in the conversation just slightly, not terribly, just because he was pushing me a little bit hard, and I am very tired. But I thought I'd give a more full response here. Now, my channel's not going back to religion for those who are watching. Yes, I got some religious stuff coming up. Yes, I got some Bart Ehrman stuff coming up, but I also got a lot of other things coming up. For instance, I got Pope Lavu that I want to talk about, which I might never get to. I got some Voltaire I want to talk about. So there's other stuff coming up. Anyway, they were asking about, is God good? And the answer is complicated. So the simple answer is yes, God's good, because whatever God decides is good is good. But is God good from the human perspective or from the animal's perspective? Well, it depends on who you are, on what you're going through. I can choose to believe God is good even if I'm in a certain situation. Other people in that same situation might question God. It's called wrestling with God. So, yes, God is good, but the definition of good is by his definition of good. So what God considers good is good, not what we consider good. So you might be someone who's pro-abortion, who's pro-gay rights, who's I'm trying to think of some other stuff, who loves pork, who only wants to wear synthetic blended fabrics, who believes in polyamorous relationships, and who thinks, I don't know, something outrageous, murder is fine, or who thinks that retributional justice is justice, that forgiveness is stupid. Okay? And all of those things that you believe in your system is good, except that those things are bad according to God. So your definition of good and God's definition of good can be two completely different things. So yes, God is good and God is benevolent, but not based on your perspective. So your human perspective limits your ability to understand what's truly good. Not just because of causal events, not just because good will come out of it one day, but you don't understand good and evil. God does. And it's not one of those philosophical or apologetic tricks where you're like, oh, it's a God of the gap thing, or it's a blind spot in your knowledge. No, this is literally your perspective. Your human intellect does not have the ability to understand what is good or what is evil. You have a animalistic nature, and that animalistic nature is always going to drag you down into personal interest. That's why you need to have self-denial if you're going to be a religious person. Self-denial is a really important thing. And if you don't have self-denial, well, then you're in the prosperity gospel. You're in the mega churches. You're in the feel-good guru business. You're not in religion. You're not in Christianity. You're not in Catholicism. You have to sacrifice. Life is suffering. Life is going to be hard, and things are going to be tough. So what you consider to be evil or what you consider to be suffering might not be evil from God's perspective. So you might think that certain things that God does is also not justified. So you might look at the slaughter of the Canaanites, or you might look at the stoning of a rebellious child as going too far. Well, you don't get to decide that. It's God's justice, not your justice. So I know that seems really harsh and really insane. And it's like, well, how can that be good if God allows those things? They're good because God says they're good. And something's evil because God says it's evil. We don't get to decide that. Now, on a micro level, we get to decide that. But in the greater scheme of things, it's actually God's decision, because we go to heaven or hell based on how God judges us, not based on how we judge ourselves. So, yeah, there you go. We can't judge each other. We just can't. You cannot go around judging people, because you don't know good and you don't know evil. Only God does. That's the honest answer, Danny, is that God is good from God's perspective, not necessarily from our perspective. So we could see something that God does, and we as humans with limited abilities, with limited cognitive abilities, can think that something that God does is evil. That just means that we're wrong and we're not living by God's will. God's will is always correct. Our will can be correct when it's aligned with God's, but when it's not aligned with God's, our will is wrong. And we can fool ourselves into believing our will is correct.